like on the next generation. To find out more about BBC Talent 2000, call 0990 11 88 88 for an information pack.
The whole business of death laid out over on BBC Two in a moment, an endless choice for today's corpse in these modern times. This is BBC One, now the 9 o'clock news and campaign report with Peter Sissons.
Tony Blair announces plans to channel national lottery money into what he calls the people's priorities, including health and education. The Wednesday draw will build up £1 billion fund, but Labour is accused of inventing it to fill a hole in its spending plans. Growing chaos at the Channel ports, but French fishermen decide tomorrow whether to obey a court order to lift the blockade. And Denis Compton, the legend who lit up the game of cricket, is dead. Good evening. Tony Blair gave details today of what a Labour government would do with the national lottery. Lottery money would be spent on what he called the people's priorities and less on projects that benefited only a minority. And the centrepiece would be a new £1 billion fund built up from the Wednesday draw to channel money into projects in healthcare and education. The Conservatives attacked the plan as simply plugging a hole in Labour's spending plans. And later they produced what they called Labour's War Book, listing the party's strengths and weaknesses. Our political editor Robin Oakley reports.
It's the people's money, say Labour of the lottery, so let's spend it on causes the majority of people care about. Under a Labour government, they pledge, proceeds of Wednesday night draws like tonight's will go to a special fund for educational and health projects. For Labour's leader, who launched the scheme at a glitzy news conference this morning, revamping the lottery's priorities is this election's big idea.
I bet you what we have done today on the lottery will be probably as important as well as popular an initiative that any political party has taken in the course of this election campaign. Here we are offering real change and real benefit in something that concerns and motivates people throughout the country.
Labour's proposals for lottery spending include a crash programme for teachers to learn information technology skills, a boost for after-school homework clubs, health check centres for healthier living, and a fund to back new talent in science and the arts. They don't plan, though, to back calls for lottery prizes to be capped at £1 million.
It is the large prizes which sell the tickets. People go for the big win, if you like. So to cap the prizes would almost certainly affect the sales and, in turn, affect the money available for the kind of project we've been talking about today.
Labour say their lottery projects won't substitute for what the taxpayer stumps up for. But teachers' unions expressed alarm at having their training funded from such uncertain revenue.
We must never see lottery money used as an excuse for failure to fund the basic needs of all state schools. And I'm very worried that if a Labour Party is the next government, it may say we've injected £1 billion or more through the lottery and therefore we are relieved in some way of our obligation.
Political opponents called Labour's idea a gimmick designed to cover holes in their tax and spending plans.
No amount of lottery, uncertain lottery money for extra top-up gimmicks is going to highlight. Fine, use the lottery money for extras, but let's sort out the core funding of health and education.
It's the frankest admission yet that their sums don't add up. They are flailing around, looking for money to pay for commitments that they've already been talking about.
Labour had to take defensive action this afternoon after opponents exploited a slip-up last night by Mr Blair, casting doubt on when Labour would cut VAT on fuel. They're promising to do so in a summer budget.
We can go ahead on this and we can introduce the change in time to help pensioners particularly get through the next winter with the VAT reduced on the fuel bills.
Labour's other embarrassment was Tory chairman Brian Mawhinney's revelation of a leaked Labour war book, which he claimed outlined Labour's smear tactics. Listing the party's perceived pluses and minuses, it referred to the young, strong but phony Tony and the decent, honest but weak John Major. The document, handed out at Tory headquarters, listed Labour's weaknesses as inexperience, interest rates, inflation, tax, the hidden left, the unions, how will they pay for their plans, and why are they evasive. Labour said it was a year-old summary of expected Tory attacks, which the Conservatives had had for 6 months. The leaking of their war book and the need to reaffirm their commitment to cutting fuel VAT have taken the edge off Labour's day. But Mr Blair and his party reckon they've struck a genuinely popular chord with their plans for spending the people's money, and they're convinced they're onto a winner. Robin Oakley, BBC News.
John Major asked Scottish voters tonight to put aside their doubts about the Conservative Party because he said the future of the United Kingdom was at risk. Speaking at a rally in Aberdeen, Mr Major said Labour would be a soft touch on the unions, on a federal Europe and on devolution. Our political correspondent Jon Sopel is with the Major campaign.
Tonight at this partisan rally, not so much a State of the Union address as a defence of it, coupled with a sustained attack on Labour's plans for devolution. Dispensing with text and lectern, John Major came forward to talk about the issue which he said stood above the party political fray.
I'm not here as an Englishman to say it's just bad for Scotland if Scotland goes it alone. I'm here as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to say to you it is wrong for the whole of the United Kingdom to see it split up and see Scotland go off separately.
But this speech didn't live up to the billing given to it by his staff, and a key quote has been reissued by Conservative Central Office tonight as a statement after the Prime Minister failed to deliver it in his off-the-cuff comments. In the statement, the Prime Minister says, "Don't let whatever doubts you may have had about the Conservative Party in the past weigh with you when the future of the United Kingdom may be at stake." Earlier in the day, the focus of the Prime Minister's attack was that it was Labour that was losing its footing on this subject. But the opposition is taking solace from reports that 2 of Scotland's big employers have apparently come round to the party's devolution policy.
We've spent a lot of time explaining to the business community that our proposals are safe, they're sensible, they're well thought through, and clearly that message is now being received by them. But it's also a huge body blow to the Prime Minister coming up here on a propaganda away day trip.
We are proposing a Scottish Parliament within the United Kingdom. We believe that is the policy which most Scots want to see coming into being. But my fear, of course, is that a Conservative government would, in spite of what they say about the Union, in fact, would produce the directly opposite result.
While the Scottish Nationalists, the only party advocating full independence, cocks a snook at both the 2 main parties.
3 things are very clear in this election campaign. 1 is you can't trust the Tories on anything. 2 is you can't trust Blair on Scotland. And the 3rd thing is you can trust the SNP to campaign for a sovereign parliament, for a sovereign people.
John Major, in a highly personal speech, has sought to reignite the issue of devolution. He's trying to link it with the subject of Europe, saying that a parliament in Edinburgh would play into the hands of the federalists in Brussels because it weakens the UK as a whole. Jon Sopel, BBC News, Aberdeen.
That's the news from the campaign trail for the moment. There'll be more later in the programme. But now, the rest of the day's news. 3 ferry companies are tonight trying to force French fishermen to lift their blockade of Channel ports. More than 1,000 British lorries are still stranded on the M20 motorway outside Dover. But there are reports that the fishermen's leaders have agreed to meet the French Agriculture Minister tomorrow morning to try to resolve the dispute. Calais, Boulogne and Dunkirk ports have been closed since yesterday as part of a protest against a European ruling on the size of fishing nets. Our correspondent Rory Cellan-Jones reports from Dover.
For more than 24 hours now, Dover has been struggling to divert the huge quantities of freight which usually go to Calais onto the longer crossing to Zeebrugge. Earlier this evening, the biggest ferry operator, P&O, was preparing to challenge the blockade of Calais after winning an injunction in the French courts.
With the court action now, with the injunction, we then have a legal right to resume our service. That will be our intention, and about 2100 tonight, a ship will leave Dover with the intention of resuming that service.
But P&O has decided there'll now be no departure for Calais this evening. The company says it's giving the trawlermen time to react to the injunctions served on them. The trawlermen's leaders are taking their case to the French Agriculture Minister tomorrow morning. They say European rules, forcing them to use nets with bigger holes, will put them out of business. And they say they regret the disruption they've caused.
We are sorry for all the people, but it's the only way to make the French government do something.
But amongst the 1,500 lorry drivers still queuing on the M20 for their chance to get across the channel, there's only anger at the wasted time and the money it's costing them.
Terrible. We ain't getting paid stood here. Our wagons are losing money, our governors are losing money. You've got some lads down there, owner drivers. They can't have them stood, they're going to lose £1,000 a day. Can't afford it.
Once again, we suffer. It's either the French fishermen or the French farmers or French truck drivers themselves. You know, I mean, what do you do?
After earlier appearing determined to beat the blockade of Calais tonight, P&O is now saying it will do nothing to inflame the situation. The company may be hoping that by tomorrow morning, the trawlermen will feel they've made their point and can lift their blockade. Rory, Cellan-Jones, BBC News, Dover.
The hostages freed from the Japanese ambassador's residence in Lima have been describing their 4-month ordeal and its dramatic conclusion. All but one of the 72 people held by the left-wing Tupac Amaru rebels survived the assault by Peruvian troops. 2 soldiers and all 14 rebels died. It was just before 3:20 in the afternoon local time when the operation began. Troops swarmed into the residence from private houses at the rear. They set off explosives in a tunnel they dug under the main hall where the rebels were playing football. More troops poured through the front gates and blew up the main door. Within minutes, soldiers positioned on the roof were leading the hostages to safety. Tom Carver is in Lima.
President Fujimori has been celebrating with his people today after one of the most extraordinary endings to a hostage crisis. The retaking of the residence began when a specially built tunnel full of explosives was detonated right under a room where the military knew that the rebels were playing indoor football. The 140 Peruvian commandos then blasted their way in through the front door and by the roof. Those rebels still alive were taken completely by surprise. The hostages, who had been huddled in a room upstairs, escaped onto the roof. Their injuries were incredibly light. 1 man dead, and Peru's foreign minister, seen here, was shot in the ankle. In less than 40 minutes, the longest siege in Latin American history was over. As the soldiers ripped down the flag of the Tupac Amaru, the remaining rebels were being shot inside the residence. The soldiers celebrated by singing their national anthem, and President Fujimori was on hand to welcome the hostages back to liberty. For a man whose political career depended on a successful outcome, this was an emotional moment. We had to act, he said, to save the hostages. Gentlemen, we will not accept terrorism in Peru. Despite the element of surprise, this had been a well-planned event that even those inside could sense was coming.
We knew in the last 2 months that some moment will come on this way because there was no other way. And in that sense we were tired to be inside, but we knew that peaceful negotiations couldn't go because there was no a real decision to negotiate at the end.
Today, the forensic experts and the bomb disposal teams have been combing the residence for booby traps. This could so easily have been a disaster. The odds were certainly stacked against such an outcome. But the army prepared meticulously, and in the end, President Fujimori's policy of not negotiating with terrorists paid off. Tom Carver, BBC News, Lima.
The United Nations Secretary-General Kofi Annan has accused Zairian rebels of deliberately trying to starve 80,000 Rwandan Hutu refugees. Mr. Annan said that the rebels were refusing to allow the UN to deliver aid to them. The refugees are currently moving south away from the rebel-held town of Kisangani in eastern Zaire. From there, Martin Dawes reports.
The refugees are a broken collection of people. It's not easy to guess how many can survive more disruption and loss of outside help. The medical centres were full, with new patients arriving all the time, and doctors were struggling to contain an outbreak of cholera. It must be assumed that the disease is moving with the people to so far unaffected areas. For the 3rd consecutive day, the rebels have prevented any access to the side of the river that houses the camps. They say they're conducting a military operation. Attacks on UN vehicles, lootings and administrative obstruction have severely hampered aid operations.
Promises have been made to the humanitarian agencies
which have not been met. And these people are in deplorable conditions. And I'm shocked and appalled by the inhumanity of those who control Eastern Zaire to these refugees, most of whom are innocent.
Many humanitarian organizations now view the process as a cynical exercise by the rebels to manipulate events and force the Hutu refugees away, presumably so that many will die.
Some local people have said that rebel soldiers attacked the refugees early yesterday morning and that they then covered up the bodies with a bulldozer. The report cannot be confirmed, but local people have no clear reason for antagonizing the new rebel authorities. And that thought gives their reports an awful credibility.
This group of refugees represent a hard core that resisted an early repatriation to Rwanda. Some may have participated in the Rwandan genocide, but there's also the young, who've survived this long by a miracle, and there's others ill and frail. Depriving them of help is merciless. The humanitarian organizations are faced with the prospect of having to re-establish a rescue operation in a place that's always posed some of the most complex logistical problems in the aid business. That's if the Zairean rebels allow them to continue their work of saving lives. Martin Dawes, BBC News, Kisangani, Eastern Zaire.
The High Court in Belfast has quashed a ruling by the Home Secretary Michael Howard that 2 IRA prisoners should spend the rest of their natural lives in prison. Paul Kavanagh and Thomas Quigley were jailed in 1985 for murdering 3 people in a series of attacks, including the bombing of Chelsea Barracks. Today the judge said Mr. Howard should have explained why he hadn't followed the trial judge's recommendation that they serve 35 years. The parents of a boy who suffered brain damage during a heart transplant at Harefield Hospital have lost their claim for damages. Matthew Pointer's parents argued that the medical team hadn't warned them of the risks before the operation. 2 separate fires have destroyed forests and heathland in the south of England. On the Isle of Wight, more than 100 firefighters battled to control a huge blaze. And in West Cornwall, a fire which engulfed 1,000 acres of heathland has now been brought under control. The Co-op has launched another attack on Andrew Regan, the businessman planning a £1 billion bid for the group. Today the Co-op wrote to Mr. Regan, his bankers and his lawyers, claiming that he'd encouraged a senior Co-op executive to supply him with confidential documents. The BBC has obtained video footage of Mr. Regan meeting the executive. Alan Green. Our business correspondent Greg Wood reports.
Andrew Regan, seen here on the right, and his business associate David Lyons are planning a £1 billion bid for the Co-op. This video footage was shot by a surveillance company working for the Co-op and supplied to the BBC by a public relations firm. It shows Mr. Regan and Mr. Lyons getting into the Jaguar of Alan Green, a senior executive of the Co-op, in a pub car park. Mr. Green is in the driver's seat, seen here running his hand up and down the roof of the car. Mr. Green and Mr. Regan held a lengthy conversation. 4 days after the meeting, Mr. Green was suspended by the Co-op for what it called a suspected recent serious breach of trust. The following day, the High Court granted the Co-op an injunction against Mr. Green, Mr. Regan and Mr. Lyons, requiring them to return any confidential information. Today, 7 boxes were filed at the High Court by Mr. Regan and his associates. They contained internal minutes and board papers belonging to the Co-op. The tussle for the soul of the Co-op has turned into one of the most bitterly contested corporate battles of recent years. The group's food retailing business has suffered a massive loss of market share, but its non-food businesses like the Co-op Bank are doing well, and it's these which interest Mr. Regan. At the moment, though, the court injunction has prevented Mr. Regan from putting forward his takeover proposals formally. No comment was available this evening from him or his advisers. Another court hearing is scheduled for this Friday, when Mr. Regan will attempt to have the injunction lifted. Greg Wood, BBC News.
The Liberal Democrat Baroness Sear has died from cancer at the age of 84. Nancy Sear, who was politically active into her 80s, became president of the Liberal Party in 1965 and was Liberal Democrat Party leader in the Lords until 3 years ago. She made several unsuccessful attempts to get into the Commons and was known for her no-nonsense approach to politics. Her commitment to women's equality led her to sponsor the Sex Discrimination Act in 1973. One of Britain's finest and best-loved cricketers, Denis Compton, has died. He was 78. Compton, who also played football for Arsenal and England, made his name as a batsman, scoring nearly 6,000 test runs. And as our sports correspondent Adam Minot reports, his charm and style on and off the field made him one of the biggest sporting stars of the post-war era.
No, is it the Ashes? Yes, England have won the Ashes.
Perhaps Denis Compton's finest hour against the Australians in 1953. He scored 123 centuries in his 20-year cricket career. Like all great batsmen, he appeared to have all the time in the world to play his shots. Compton was a boy's own sporting idol, the first cricketer to appear in adverts as the Brill Cream Boy. He also played football for England and Arsenal.
The Arsenal brought in cricketer Compton to pep up the attack. And from a goring pass, that's just what Denis does, scoring the goal of the match.
In the post-war years of austerity, his batting helped lift the spirits of the nation. And in the golden summer of 1947, he scored more runs and more hundreds than anyone before or since.
Every time I went to the wicket, I seemed to score 100, you know, and it's like everything else that when your luck's in, you know, you must take full advantage of it.
One match against Australia in 1948, when he was hit on the head by a bouncer, became known as the Compton Test. After a couple of stitches, he came back to score an undefeated 145 and save the game. His batting inspired many he played with and those who followed him.
England have had, although they've had many superb players, one or two great players, there's been no one quite in his mould, and there might never be one quite so freakish. Yet at the same time, having said that, he worked very hard at it. He had huge pride of performance.
A knee injury forced his retirement in 1957. He worked on as a journalist and commentator. The brilliance of his batting will be an enduring memory.
Celtic took on Falkirk tonight in the Tennent's Scottish Cup semi-final replay. Highlights of the game can be seen by viewers in Scotland on Sports Scene on BBC One at 10 p.m. If you don't want to know the latest score, look away now. Manchester United have failed to make the final of the European Champions League after losing the second leg of the semi-final 1-0 at Old Trafford. Borussia Dortmund won 2-0 on aggregate.
Following the success of the Dortmund street party, the city of Manchester returned the gesture. It kept the visitors happy and the generosity continued down the road. After just 8 minutes, Lars Ricken was offered both time and space, and via a Pallister deflection gave the German champions a valuable away goal. United, though, continued to have much of the game. Andy Cole gave Eric Cantona a good chance, but Jurgen Kohler's studs somehow kept the Germans ahead. United's pursuit of the Dortmund goalmouth gathered momentum as the half went on, but among others, Pallister was unable to repeat his recent ability to find the net. Andy Cole had chances too, but lacked the composure to meet his manager's expectations. The second half saw more of the same. Cantona got past the keeper, but the Dortmund defence stood firm. The hurricane expected by the visitors continued, but failed to do any damage, and United eventually ran out of puff. A disallowed goal summed up United's night, and the European Cup then still eludes them. But, barring mathematical improbabilities, they'll be back next season. Nigel Gainsborough, BBC News.
Coming up on tonight's 9 o'clock news, in the battle for votes over Europe, the parties have ruthlessly exploited the symbols of British sovereignty. But behind the rhetoric, how will European social law affect business? But first, to the latest of our interviews with the party leaders. Tonight with the Scottish National Party leader, Alex Salmond. I began by asking him from Inverness whether his party was out of tune with most Scots who don't appear to want complete independence.
Well, the last opinion poll on the constitutional option showed 35% in favour of independence and 36% in favour of devolution. Now, obviously, I'm not satisfied with 35%, but that's a growing trend, and I don't think it'll be very long before independence becomes the first choice of most of the Scottish population.
Wouldn't independence be a huge gamble in an uncertain world? At the very least, wouldn't it be your duty to see if a measure of self-government, if that's what the people of Scotland wanted, worked first?
No, because the measure of devolution that Labour is now talking about is equivalent to an English parish council, or as the Labour Party leader, the new Labour leader, says, sovereignty would reside with him and other English MPs. Now, I think most people in Scotland want a powerhouse parliament. They want a parliament which will actually do things to improve Scottish society. They most certainly don't want a parish council, English or otherwise.
So when, if there is a Labour government, they put the question to the Scottish people about whether they want a Scottish Parliament, how will you recommend your supporters to vote?
Well, we'll have to find out what's in the white paper and what the questions are, because I think many, many people in Scotland, the overwhelming majority, even of Labour supporters, would want to see independence on the ballot paper. If it were on the ballot paper, we'd vote first for independence, second for devolution, and third for the status quo. But in the light of all the contradictions, the chaos and the turmoil in the Labour Party devolution policy, it'd be a foolish person indeed which tries to speculate what exactly Labour's going to have in their white paper after the election.
John Major is saying tonight that this should be above party. Doesn't history show that the United Kingdom is a greater force than the sum of its parts?
No, I think history shows that Scotland hasn't achieved its full potential over the last few decades, and more Scots are looking to a future as an independent nation. I mean, we haven't achieved anything like what we should have in terms of economic growth. There are huge concerns about the divisions that have been engendered in Scottish society through government from London. And I think many Scots are fed up with remote control, fed up with Scotland being run down from Westminster, and would like to run a country of our own.
But many Scots are deeply loyal, if not to the Union, which you would contest, at least to the monarchy. The government, Ian Lang, the Scottish Secretary, alleges that it is your aim to turn an independent Scotland into a socialist republic. What do you say to that?
Well, Ian Lang's a desperate man, and given the position in Galloway and Nithsdale, he's got every reason to be desperate. I mean, our policy is quite clear. The Queen would remain head of state of an independent Scotland, should be accorded the dignity and respect of a head of state. What we would sweep away, of course, is the entrenched privilege and the panoply, the royal prerogative of the House of Lords. And we'd have instead a written constitution where all people would be treated equally, and people would be citizens of Scotland, not subjects of anyone.
Alex Salmond. And now we go over to Anne Perkins at our Westminster campaign desk for her nightly election roundup.
Evening, Peter. The Liberal Democrats used Shakespeare's birthday today to ram home their message on education. The promise was to refill every child's satchel with books at a cost of over 5 years of almost £2 billion. A primary school visit followed, with the emphasis once again in the Ashdown campaign on establishing real dialogue with the voters.
He may be just a face on a school computer screen normally, but today this politician came to life for children in Newbury. For Paddy Ashdown, such school visits have become extremely familiar.
But these are quite old computers. We need new ones. Absolutely no money to replace them.
Paddy Ashdown's watchword throughout this campaign has been dialogue, listening to people's real concerns about education and other issues. One of his favoured methods has been round-circle discussions with invited members of the public and specialists. Today's, the last, was in Bath.
Education is supposed to be the centrepiece of this election campaign.
And for 40 minutes it provided a lively, if polite, discussion.
Two things, reduce primary class sizes. The other thing, increase the status of teachers as a profession.
Yeah, we haven't touched teachers and teachers' morale. Absolutely.
Teacher training.
Party strategists view this type of event as an innovation. Proof of Paddy Ashdown's credentials as a leader who likes to talk and listen. The audience is designed as a cross-section of the public across political divides. Not that these meetings can influence policy, the manifesto's already published after all, but Paddy Ashdown feels they're worth it.
It is an attempt to try and establish a dialogue of politician with the average person, rather than simply through the medium of the press or from platforms and to large audiences.
Tonight, Paddy Ashdown's still campaigning with a 2-hour visit, most of it away from our cameras, to a special project for children with behavioural problems like truancy in South London. Early education, Paddy Ashdown feels, can nip such problems in the bud, and only his party is truly committed to funding it. Carolyn Quinn, BBC News, with the Ashdown campaign.
The Conservatives were wooing the older vote today, unveiling a 5-point plan pledging to protect pensioners' living standards. The Social Security Secretary, Peter Lilly, said they'd guarantee the basic state pension against inflation, continue to give more to the frail and less well off, and expand provision for respite care. In 1987, Kinnock the movie made voting Labour look glamorous. In 1992, Major the movie said Conservatives understood poverty and struggle. Tomorrow, Labour's election broadcast introduces Blair, the home movie, starring Tony Blair as the kind of Labour leader discontented Tories needn't be afraid of, an ordinary bloke who even understands why some people find politics boring.
If you'd said to me at sort of 18, 19, you're going to be a politician, I would have said, forget it. Anything else, anything but being a politician.
Why? On what grounds? Why?
Because I thought politicians were complete pains in the backside.
Paddy Ashdown, as we've seen, prides himself on listening to as many views as possible on the campaign trail. But even he was a little challenged today when, after his education meeting, he was confronted by a cow, a badger and a dormouse. They ambushed Paddy Ashdown on his way out of a school. It was an opportunity for him to demonstrate liberal democracy in action.
Shush, shush, shush. Let's have a little debate about it. Now, if you want to go and sit over here, we can have a discussion in a civilised fashion. Excellent. Good luck to that.
3 weeks into this campaign, there's nothing odd about talking politics with animals.
Come on, round you come. Round you come, this sheep person. Right. Now, hang on. Badger person. I beg your pardon. I'm sorry to get it wrong.
They wanted to complain about what they said was the failure to consider the damage to their homes caused by the bypass.
What are you going to make? This is the badger.
I'm a dormouse.
It's very... It's your dormouse. Oh, you're dormouse. I'm sorry. I was informed you were a badger.
Most of my...
Are you a dormouse or a badger? Sorry.
I'm a dormouse.
You're a dormouse, fine. Hang on. Any other members of the animal kingdom like to speak at this point? This cow over here hasn't had a chance to make a point. Would you like to make a point? We've heard from the dormouse, and now we'd very much like to hear from them.
I'm a local resident. I used to be a Liberal voter, but I'm afraid I will not vote anymore.
Mr. Ashdown made his excuses and left. The ballot box, he said, would be the final judge. And the millionaire Alan Sugar, who heads Amstrad and Tottenham Hotspur, said tonight he was backing Labour. Known in the 80s as one of Mrs. Thatcher's favourite businessmen, Mr. Sugar said Tony Blair was dynamic, enthusiastic and understood how business works. Back to you, Peter.
And Perkins. Europe is a central issue in this election campaign, with the parties trading blows, particularly over the social chapter, which governs conditions at work. Labour and the Liberal Democrats would sign up to it, but the Conservatives say it would damage the economy. The European social chapter stipulates that big companies must establish works councils to inform and consult employees. It gives working parents 3 months unpaid leave after having a child, and it would remove a country's veto over some future social legislation. Our Europe business correspondent Jonathan Charles examines how the social chapter works.
Born free, the British lion is supposed to symbolise a strong, independent nation. But this particular animal faces extinction, according to the Conservatives. If Labour signs up for the social chapter, it's claimed thousands of jobs may be lost. At Woburn Safari Park, home of the real lions, all the political debate has left staff confused.
The amount of information that is around on it to the general public is so minimal. I mean, before anybody could decide on whether they actually agree with it or disagree with it, if it could be put into plain English so normal people can understand it and understand what it's all about and how it's going to affect them, rather than politicians just banding it about between themselves, saying it'll do this, that and the other.
To the lion keepers, the social chapter has become a catch-all phrase to cover every EU policy affecting business. In fact, it has less meat on it than they think. For now, it's a limited menu containing just 2 measures. Workers are allowed 3 months unpaid paternity leave, and in some cases have the right to be consulted by the management on company policy. The feeding frenzy surrounding the issue has led to the perception that businesses wouldn't be free to manage. But so far, the social chapter's more about aims rather than hard legislation. The social chapter is designed, according to its architects, to foster a spirit of partnership between workers and employers. It's based on a model operated widely in mainland Europe. The idea is that cooperation can guarantee minimum standards for staff without jeopardizing flexibility or competitiveness. The symbolic British lion has been free to roam as a result of the government's opt-out. But down the road at the Golden Lion pub, workers and bosses are split over the merits. Barry Friend is one of 320 staff employed by the Tudor Inn Group. As he gets ready to welcome customers, Barry knows the company's owners are worried about the costs of implementing the chapter. But he believes any measures to improve the workers' lot must be a good thing. Why shouldn't people here have the same rights as those elsewhere?
Other countries in mainland Europe tend to get a better deal than Britain does. It seems to be that we're always the underdog. They're obviously got a better lifestyle than we have. They seem to work shorter hours, have more money in their pocket. Why can't we have the same thing?
I'm just very worried that my business will cease to be. At my size of business, we operate, I won't say on a shoestring, but we operate very close to the line, and if we have to legislate any more, then we could be out of business.
But while Britain has remained outside, other European Union countries have been putting the laws into practice. In Germany, many of the ideas in the social chapter have been in force for decades, with little controversy. The staff making Lion gaming machines are used to worker consultation, a central plank of the social chapter. Employees regularly discuss strategy with the management at a joint works council. The firm says the cost is minimal, efficiency is increased because everyone feels involved.
Workers are much more educated today than they have been maybe 50 or 100 years ago. They can talk the language of management, and on the other side, managers are moving towards the workers as well. They speak their language, they try to speak their language to understand each other, so it's a coming together from both sides.
Here, productivity and consultation go hand in hand.
Diese Kommunikation zwischen Unternehmensleitung und Betriebsräte.
This communication between workers and management representatives is very good. It leads to fewer problems. When things aren't clear, it can be sorted out.
Verständnisvolle Partner in den Unternehmensleitungen.
The success of works councils at German companies has been noted by some of their British counterparts. They feel that joining the social chapter might not now be such a gamble. At the Golden Lion pub, though, managers fear British membership may encourage the EU to pile further laws onto the limited measures now in place.
I'm just worried that, although there's only a couple of things there at the minute, it's what's going to come in later. And again, it's this fear of just being bogged down with legislation when really what we're trying to do is make a living.
As the British Lion's fate is fought over, companies are following the battle closely. Now the animal's future must await the election outcome.
Jonathan Charles reporting. And you can find out more information on the party's policies on Europe in our election fact file on page 130 of CFAX after this bulletin. An opinion poll suggesting a rise in support for the Conservatives made the newspaper headlines this morning. There are two more opinion polls out tonight. Here's Peter Snow to analyse them for us.
Well, tonight's two polls do not endorse the sharp rise in Conservative support in that earlier poll Peter mentioned. Indeed, they suggest the opposite, an increasing Labour lead. It's a sobering lesson in not getting overexcited about one poll. In tomorrow's Daily Telegraph, the latest rolling Gallup poll puts Labour on 50, the same as the Sunday Telegraph 3 days ago, the Conservatives on 30, down 1, and the Liberal Democrats on 12. Murray in tomorrow's Times have Labour on 48, down 1 from last week, the Conservatives on 27, down 5, and the lowest Tory rating in any poll since mid-March. And Murray put the Liberal Democrats on 17, that's up 4. So, sharply contrasting messages from the polls in the middle of this 6th week of the campaign. Let's look at Labour first, starting in the mid-50s, up on the left there, in the first week of the campaign, coming down to the high 40s, but here at the very end, registering only 42 in ICM in this morning's Guardian. So Labour's range, which starts quite tight, varies from 42 to 50 in this last week over here, this past half week. Their average showing a slow decline, but still ending in the high 40s. The Tories, never more than 3 points above or below 31%, until this morning's ICM put them as high as 37. And then in sharp contrast, tonight's Mori poll putting them as low as 27. So a wide range here at the end for the Tories too, but their average still remains very steady on just over 30. And the Liberal Democrats up a little through the campaign with their range ending tonight at between 12 and 17%. On average, they've now flattened out on the whole the last couple of weeks to stay just below 15%. So, Labour ahead tonight, but by how much? Well, the Tories had a lead of 8% in the last election, and tonight we now have Labour leads of 21% in Mori, 20% in Gallup, and this morning only 5% in ICM. ICM is way out on its own. Now, they say at ICM that their private polling for the Tory party has been showing Labour leads as low as 6 or 7% in the past few days. So, ICM could be nearer the truth than the others, but it could also simply prove the theory that one poll in 20 can be way out of line. Now, the swing that those three polls represent is anything between 6 in ICM and 14% in the others to Labour from the last election. So, on with the swingometer to give us an illustration of what swings like that would mean if they're reflected on polling day, a week tomorrow. Labour need a swing to turn enough Tory seats red with a swing of 4.5% to win an overall majority of 1. Well, ICM's swing of 6%, by far the best news, if it's right, that the Tories have had yet, would put Labour in with a majority of around 50, but Gallup and Mori suggest a swing much bigger than that, a swing of 14%, more in line with earlier polls, and that would see Labour in with a majority of some 200. But there is some other evidence that the Tories are narrowing the gap. Take the leadership stakes. Now, 3 weeks ago, Tony Blair was comfortably ahead. Asked who'd make the best Prime Minister, ICM put him 13 points ahead of Mr Major, Mori put him 24 points ahead, and Gallup 13 points ahead. Today, ICM has Mr Major ahead by 1 point. Mori has Mr Blair's lead reduced to 12 points, and Gallup has the same. And what about the Tories' big hope that Europe or the economy will rescue them? Well, on the economy, a double-edged verdict from Mori tonight. Nearly half of all respondents accepted that the government had built strong foundations for recovery, with only 43% saying the government had failed to do that. But of that 48% who recognised the government's achievement, a lot less than half said the government deserved to win the election, with well over half, 28% of all those interviewed, saying that, OK, they'd put the foundations in for recovery, but it was time for a change. People may feel better off, but many of them do not believe that Labour will ruin it. And who's gained from all the fuss over Europe of the past few days? Well, there are some signs that it may have left the Tories looking as divided as ever, but nevertheless won them more support. 3 weeks ago, asked by Gallup which party best represented their views on Europe, 47% plumped for Labour, 35% for Tories, and 18% named another party or didn't know. Tonight, 40% say Labour, 38% Conservative. So the Tories have nearly caught up on this issue here. So you might expect people to be saying that the Tories are fighting a good campaign, but that's not what Mori found in their interviewing yesterday. Asked who was fighting most effectively, Labour scored 3 times better than the Tories,
Peter Snow. And the main election news tonight, Tony Blair promises a people's lottery to channel £1 billion into health and education. The other parties say it's to fill a black hole in Labour's spending plans. Well, we're joined now by our political editor, Robin Oakley. Robin, reform of the lottery is in the Labour manifesto, but not this Wednesday billion. Presumably that's why the other parties suspect it's been dreamed up to fill a gap.
Yes, I mean, it's a very good theme for Labour to fit into their general concept of being a party, as they say, for the many, not the few. There's this fear that too much of the lottery money has gone on big national prestige projects. They wanted to go and help people in areas that haven't benefited very much from it, and they really think it's a very strong plus for them. But of course the weakness is if they're seen as taking money or spending money on things that should really be financed by tax, and the teachers' unions and the churches are already showing their disquiet.
Brief one on Labour's War Book, which Brian Mulwiney produced. He's had it for 6 months and he's produced it at the best time, he hopes, to embarrass them. Has it worked?
Well, yes, I think it has worked. I mean, here is the War Book saying things like Labour will turn the clock back, Labour will pile the costs onto business. It's all about their opponents' perceptions. All parties have documents of this kind. It's always embarrassing when they hit the light.
Now, the polls, or at least one or two of them, have given the Tories a lift. Have correspondingly the Labour side got a fit of the jitters?
Well, in a sense, both major parties have been very uncomfortable with these polls showing a huge Labour lead. Both want to feel more comfortable and more natural when the polls are down to the sort of levels we're used to in the past. Labour, because they don't want their troops to be complacent, and because they want us in the media to start putting the focus on what would happen under a fifth-term Tory government. But the Tories, of course, are desperate to restore their morale and have some sense of something still to fight for. So they want the gap to close as well.
Robin Oakley, thank you. And that's the news tonight. Newsnight is on BBC Two at 10:35. From the 9 o'clock news, good night.